Hey, what's up? I'm Guy.
I'm John.
This is our YouTube channel. Subscribe to this channel and give this video a like.
Check out the podcast below in the description.
So, we did a video after the Raiders season ended about how the least of the Raiders' issues is Derek Carr and just how refreshing that is. The last couple of years, the offseason discussion has been, can Carr take the next step, all that kind of stuff. He is not the reason the Raiders did not make the playoffs this year, which led me to ask you this question, John. Who moves out of the neighborhood first, Gruden or Carr at this point? Which is another way of saying who's the bigger question mark right now for the Raiders? It's Gruden.
Yeah,
I don't know if he moves first, but
well, you told me that people were on the video we posted. I think we did on the podcast too. That were saying that if you're going to give Carr, who now has established himself as a good NFL quarterback, credit, you got to give Gruden credit, which is true.
Absolutely fair.
But part of being the head coach is you get blame or credit for everything. Like if all of a sudden you just fix the offense, that's great. If the defense regresses when it was already shitty, and you have to fire a coach that you handpick coming here, I got a red flag on you. When you make, I would say, two pretty historic moves. I guess trading Amari is not that. That's happened before. A new coach comes in, trade a player for a first-round pick. The Khalil Mack thing, I remember there were stats. No player that had won an all-pro position the previous year had ever been traded the following year. Remember, the moment it happened, it was historic the way a player with that accomplishment had been moved. Like that is part of Gruden's resume, right? Amari Cooper, I was texting you during the game. I just ended up, I don't watch that much Cowboy football, but I do go to their box scores a lot just because they got three wide receivers. Even Gallup, who is the least famous of the three, just if you pick him on the right daily fantasy day, he'll fucking produce for you. Amari had a career year this year in catches. He was middle of that game, he was over 90. So, and I follow a bunch of Cowboy people like, Dallas does not regret, like they got 92 catches, 1,100 yards out of Amari Cooper this year. 92 catches. On a team with CeeDee Lamb, who's a young star, and Michael Gallup, who's probably like, if he's the number three, he's the best number three in the league. And they didn't have a quarterback, right? Once Dak gets hurt, he's playing with Andy. He played with the one dude from like James Madison. Remember that we were making
do I remember? DeChico's Pizza?
Yeah.
DiNucci. Ben DiNucci.
Yeah, that the team account was just their coach at home on his TV, like so happy that DiNucci got it. It honestly was very refreshing to see something like that. But that, like, Amari, if anything, Khalil to me has been a little hit or miss. But relative to what the Raiders have, they would, do anything to have a Khalil Mack. And Amari's just been really good. Like, it's just that, but that's part of Gruden. And then Gruden makes these moves, and he's already mad at Arnett, and he's critical of Abram for not playing the right way, and he's having to fire his defensive coordinator. And now there are rumors that he's going to go after Gus Bradley. I got news for you. If Gus Bradley has options, because Gus Bradley's been a head coach for 4 or 5 years. A top coordinator in the league makes $2 to $3 million. Gus Bradley is rich, and he's going to be sought after. Like he's going to have options. I would say on paper, the Raiders on paper, you have a coach that doesn't feel like he values defense, right? You just saw he had what I thought was like his best friend, fired him. And now he's just going to go to Gus Bradley, and it's just going to be cool. Like, it does feel like, especially if you're Gus, like you just came from Anthony Lynn, like clearly a really high-level human. The team underachieved, even though when you look at the records, they've had way more wins the last 3 years than the Raiders. Like, I think sometimes we equate the Raiders, and you've done a good job of this in Dubois, of like, we act like the Raiders
have had Dubois in the same sentence.
We act like they've had more success than they've had. They just haven't. And so if you're Gus, it's a double whammy. You're already rich, so whoever wants you, and multiple people are going to want him, they're going to pay him. So two, you're going to look at, well, our defensive roster is pitiful. I don't even think the head coach will go to, like, it's just a weird spot to be in. I don't think it's a desirable job.
And the other part of that is, can they pay?
That falls on Jon Gruden.
Yeah, and can they pay as much as somebody else could pay, say Gus Bradley? But you're right. That's if it was just about Carr, that's offensive coordinator standards. We're like, hey, good job with the quarterback. You've done your job. It's the primary part of Gruden's job, but it's not the only part of his job. And a lot of what we've talked about over the last few years is draft picks and handling players who needed to get paid, like Amari or Khalil Mack. And hiring the defensive coordinator falls under your purview. Like all this stuff. You don't.
Think about this. When the Chiefs lost to the Patriots in that game where D Ford went off sides, but if you remember that year, their defense was pretty pitiful. Andy fired Bob Sutton, who had been his defensive coordinator the entire time he'd been in Kansas City. And people forget this, but when Alex first got there, I'd say like the first 2.5 to definitely maybe 3.5 years, they were a defensive team. The last couple years, Alex really came on. When Andy first got there, Justin Houston, Tom Bali, Dontari Poe, Derek Johnson, Eric Berry, they had their defense was. I remember going to a game against Harbaugh in 2014, and it was just a slugfest. It was like they were a defensive-oriented team. Then the defense kind of got old. He fired him, and I think he really liked Bob Sutton. He hired Steve Spagnuolo.
Yeah.
What happened last year? Their defense toward the end of the season came on. They won the Super Bowl. This year again, like you watch the Chiefs, like their offense actually has been hit or miss the second half of the season. Their defense is good.
Even
like
yeah.
That's Andy Reid. Like that's Mahomes. It's more than just Mahomes and Tyreek Hill. It's the defense. It's working with Veach. It's everything. Like being the head coach, I really truly believe this. It's probably one of the harder CEO jobs. It's not technically the CEO, but you are more important than technically the CEO of a franchise, right? You make more money than him. You're in charge of fucking everything that matters.
Especially if you have player control.
Yeah, which most of the top coaches do.
Yeah.
Which Jon does. So Jon, as a $10 million, you can call him a head coach or you can call him a CEO. Like if everything that encompasses that bill, like if you're Bob Iger, it's not just about the movies. It's part of the theme parks and ESPN. Like
and the cruise ships.
Yeah, it's all you.
Yeah. Yep.
And I just think Gruden.
And you don't get to say, well, our movie division is crushing it. It's like, okay, what about all your other division? Like think of, I think, the Iger thing's great. Think of a football team as everything is a different division. Well, your quarterbacking division is crushing it. But your drafting position's questionable. The players you decide to spend your money on is questionable. Your defensive division is questionable. Like these are all your divisions. Your, I don't know, team discipline division did not seem like it was very good this year. Your quarterback division is great. Well, congrats. That's a great division to have. But it's not the only division you have. Not when you're the head coach.
How about this?
If he was the offensive coordinator of this team, Jon, he'd get a head coaching job this year. But he's not. He's the head coach of the team.
This area is really hard. It's really hard. The game management part, and I'd say most coaches are bad, but Jon is part of that bad coaches. Like he had some and I think most Raider fans will agree, they had some moments that were head scratching on just pretty basic, like, bro, you're not going to go for it here. When his team had established who he is. So him as a coach, how about that guy? Him as an in-game coach, not dialing up the play to hit Aguilar, but like, hey, do I need to call a timeout? Do we need to go for it? I'd say Gruden gets a fail on that, which no one even remembered that part of him because it was so far removed. Besides like some diehard, I have a couple diehard Raider fans that go, yeah, Gruden was really conservative in his Raider time. But I always push back and be like, yeah, the league was. The league's changed. And part of him being gone for 10 years, he's been in the lab. He's been learning. He's been thinking. He's changed. And then what happens? He comes back and it feels like he's playing like it's 2000 where your defense is giving up 30 points a game. Like, Jon, you got to go for it. He cost them the opportunity to win some games with just not going for it. When they were in position by kicking field goals, and then it snowballed them like 3 different times.
Well, and part of that, I think, if I think back to the criticism sometimes, it was like it almost felt like he was giving his defense more credit than they deserved, right? You're like relying on your defense when no one believes in your defense.
Isn't the number one thing as a leader / as a CEO / as a head coach / as a, doing anything is being able to understand whatever you have, whatever your business is, whatever your team is, truly understand what your strengths and weaknesses are.
Don't put a round peg in a square hole.
Well, I think Bill Belichick, how they did that top 100 players this year and he sat down, in like every position. And they asked him, I think it was the quarterback time, and Peyton showed up and Brady showed up. I think Brady was there the whole time with him. And they asked Bill, like, how he's been so successful. And he gave a pretty basic answer, but it's like most people don't. He's like, football isn't that complicated. He's like, it goes back to the art of war. You take your strengths against their weaknesses, and you try to avoid your weaknesses against their strengths. Like that kind of is football, right? If they don't have – Kyle's king of this. His game plan. You can tell immediately if he thinks like, yeah, they don't tackle well on the edges. Or, he thinks their linebackers, overcommit to one side. But it's just pretty basic stuff where Like, I think Gruden has a pretty good idea of that with his offense, but I don't think he sees that with his defense at all. And that's, to me, part of your head coach. For a guy also, like sometimes Andy, I'd say does this more than most coaches, sits on the bench during defense. Like
McVay style?
Yeah, he has a lot of faith in his defensive coordinator. Gruden is always standing there. Like Gruden's not over with Carr, Greg Olsen is.
Yeah.
So it's like you're watching the entire process play out here, buddy.
I remember, and I think I've seen this quote repurposed in the last month or two, but I remember watching it, Urban Meyer this year on one of the Saturday Fox pregame shows, saying how much he hates when anybody on it, how much he would hate when they were in a coaching meeting and somebody on the staff would say a player's not good or this guy stinks, so we can't use him. Right, Urban's you get very animated. I've seen I've seen him say it now twice, where he's like, "No."
It was one of his big things that went viral this year.
Well, yeah, it definitely went viral. You're right. His point is no. There are players. We got to find something they do well and make the most out of it. Like I think if you watch a lot, as I did this year, I watched a ton of Urban every Saturday, and we'll get to him coming up. But a lot of his stuff is very simple. It's just about having core tenets, always coming back to them, always understanding what they are. I was talking about this with someone yesterday about Dana Altman, who's the basketball coach at Oregon. And I've been to several of his practices, and he's really good. Like I think he's a Hall of Fame coach. He should be probably in the end. And he's got really good players. But I've been to a few of his practices, and he's got this thing, like people make fun of it. He says it so much. You know what he says all the time? Bend your knees. And if you watch him coach for an hour and a half, you'll hear him say the phrase, bend your knees, 45 times. I've been to multiple practices and shoot-arounds, and it's always, bend your knees, bend your knees, everything. Bend your knees, bend your knees. And I think from the outside, people are like, oh, this guy's he's a genius. What does the genius do? It's like the basics over and over and over again.
Well, it's like when I think of the two best quarterbacks that I've lived through, because I don't really count Elway, Marino, and Montana. The 80s just don't. When I think Brady and Manning, I think those guys attacked individual drills equally as hard as their team drills. And I think coaches, if you've ever read anything from Lou Holtz to Nick Saban to John Wooden, what was John Wooden's thing about putting your fucking your socks on right so you didn't get blitzed? And I think sometimes people in football, because part of John is, got all this credit for being the smartest guy in the room, they go to 100 too fast, and you leave all these people in the dust. Where my beef with coaches has always been, no one and the best coaches always tell their coaches, no one cares what you know. Like, you don't get to run the route or whatever. So if you implement these schemes, whatever the Raiders were doing, the players have no clue. Like, they always feel pretty consistently the most lost defense in the league. Like, guys just looking all around. Can't Gruden get involved and just come in and just be like, hey, let's just run one coverage today and just do it well and just see how it goes? Because it can't be any worse than what we are doing. It's just basic things that I bet a Dana Altman and Nick Saban, before we can do zone pattern matching, can we just fucking run man coverage and just all game, the only call for our DBs, just or whatever the zone defense is, that's where they go, but no other calls. And that to me is what's so frustrating, I think, for a lot of, if you have a fan of a team, when you have a coach that what? I think sometimes it gets too complicated.